Revelation 6:12, I looked when he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. And the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Now, let me just stop for a second and just point out the obvious, that this is allegorical language. Stars don't fall to the earth. Every star that I know of is considerably larger than the earth. And every star that I know of would consume the earth were it to fall to the earth, or if the earth were to fall into the star. Our star is many, many, many times the size of the earth, and so stars can't fall to the earth. And the sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up. These are obviously, this is language you'll find throughout the prophets talking about judgment. God's judgment coming upon nations, God's judgment coming upon Israel. There are different aspects that you'll find utilized. And what you have here is the creatureliness of creation. Every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Well, mountains and islands, those are, to us, those are things that never, ever change and never move. But they're all moved because everything that mankind thought was unmovable and firm and sure gets shaken, sort of like today, sort of like in our own day. This is taking place. And of course, the stars of the sky. How did ships at sea, how did they navigate in the ancient world? You know, now today we've got GPS. Well, until you know that the new form of warfare involves shooting down your enemy's spy satellites. And so everything we have that's GPS could disappear before long. But, you know, we think all that's certain, right? But how did they navigate in the past? They navigated by the stars. Well, how could you navigate by the stars? Because they were always in the same place. That's why. That's why planets stood out over against the stars. The constellations were always the constellations. They always rose and set at the exact same time to the same time of each year. That's how you knew what the year was. But the planets, from the Greek term planao, to wander, went their own way. And sometimes they went this way, and then sometimes they went that way because of the orbit around the sun. Sorry for those of you flat earthers out there that are a little confused, but can't help you out much. Anyway, and so there was a firmness. So if they fall to the earth, then the entire created order has been shaken and is being changed. Judgment is taking place. And so that's what you've got going here. Then the kings of the earth, so you've got the most powerful people there are. The kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks and the mountains. And so what's that? Well, that's all of society, from top to bottom and everything in between. So you've got the kings of the earth, the great men, the commanders, the rich, strong, even the slave and the free man. The entirety of society. They hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? So I've said many times, I think one of the most striking images in all of Scripture, honestly, is this image of the wrath of the Lamb. The wrath of the Lamb. That is a phrase that only has meaning here in this context once you understand who the Lamb is, what the Lamb has done, the nature of the Lamb as the God-man, the resurrection, the place of intercession before the Father, the power, the fact that he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and end, the first and last. You put all that together, and the wrath of the Lamb is understandable. The time of his judgment has come. All judgment has been entrusted to him. And he is the perfect one to whom to entrust all judgment. Makes perfect sense when you have the context. But still, the wrath of the Lamb. Now, let's say a copy of this got intercepted by a Roman soldier 200 years after this, because that's about when the worst persecution would be taking place. It was still about 200 years down the road. Seriously, this is, depending on how you date it, there are people who date it pre-70, there's people date it late for a century, mid-90s. No matter what, 200 years later, let's say the 260s or the 290s, either one, you're smack dab in the middle of the worst period of persecution that the church is going to experience, at least under the Roman Empire at that time. And so that type of persecution had not yet become empire-wide, but it would eventually. It would eventually be gain that kind of level of intensity. But it has started in the first century. The persecution, it's reflected in some of the wording of the letters to the churches in the first chapters of the book. And so here is this wrath of God being poured out. And how would that be encouraging to anyone? If a Roman soldier, if a Roman soldier found this and read this, how would he have any idea what it's talking about? How would he the wrath of the Lamb? He would think some crazy people on some type of pharmaceuticals had written this stuff. He wouldn't have any idea. But the Christian has the context in which to place this to understand, oh, yeah, the wrath of the Lamb. And since these people would know all about the Old Testament, they would know that, for example, verse 16 is coming from Hosea. So, in fact, again, this is one of the reasons I've highly suggested this. If you have a Bible translation that places Old Testament citations in italics or bold block or whatever, it's really helpful. But what would this have said to the people who first received this letter, and indeed to all Christians for the next 250 some odd years? Nearly a quarter of a millennium? What would it have meant to them? What would it have said to them? Put yourself amongst the Christians who were slaughtered in Lyon around 180-ish, probably when Irenaeus loses his life. Some famous stories of the people being fed to the lions there. Put yourself amongst the survivors of that, the ones who weren't taken, but they lost their loved ones. Now read the book of Revelation. What's it saying to you? What's the encouragement? What does it mean to know that justice will be done? What does it mean to know that Jesus will judge, and he will judge all men, kings of the earth, great men, commanders, rich and strong, slave and free, will all tremble at the expression of his wrath. There's also in this section the martyrs, the souls under the altar. How long? How long, O Lord? All of these things would have direct meaning to the people at that time, and it's primarily a message of hope. Remain faithful in the midst of trial and difficulty. And the fact that when you look at the book of Revelation, there's all sorts of activities of mankind, but they're futile. Kings and emperors and entire empires thrown down by God cannot even begin to stop the purposes of God. They may, and the very fact that they stand against those purposes of God brings about their destruction. Brings about their destruction. when you want to hear that in that context, it says a lot to the Pilgrim Church, to the church that is facing uncertain future. Can you imagine what it was like to be in the first century church? You have no church history. You have the people of Israel, but you have no history of a people going out into all the world. You don't have those shoulders of giants to stand on. And you have the largest, most powerful empire in the world arrayed against you, swearing your own destruction. Doesn't look overly promising, does it? But think what has happened since then. Think how many times our forefathers have been absolutely convinced this is it. This has got to be it. This has got to be it. I mean, plague wipes out 50 to 75% of everybody in Europe. It's got to be it. This is if this isn't the one of the horses of the apocalypse, it's all of them at the same time, right? So many things have happened in church history that convinced good people at the time this is it. And yet here we are. Here we are. And I know the tendency for me is to look at the future and go, oh, man. Because I've got a healthy understanding of the depravity of man. I know my own heart. And so I look at what's going on and I go, well, this could happen and that could happen and these people want to do this. And sadly, most of the time I'm right. But still, it's so easy to go, well, this is it. This is time's up. And every generation has done it. Every generation has done it. Has seen that this has got to be it. Wrapping things up. Can't get any worse. It could get worse. So let's wrap it up now. That type of thing. And yet the message is there's a scroll. It's written. He's sovereign. And when the one who is faithful and true rides out upon his horse to finally wrap everything up, nobody can stop him. But you see, it was all written from the first. There's a purpose from the beginning. Once you understand the sovereignty of God, changes everything. Absolutely changes everything. One of the things I'm certainly thinking of these days as the world around us just seems to get crazier and crazier and crazier and crazier.